Today, we're going to be talking about important reform movements. First up, we have the abolitionist movement. This is a movement dedicated to ending slavery everywhere in the U.S., and we have some key reformers to note. First up, we have Frederick Douglass. He was a former slave who was famous for his oratory and his incisive anti-slavery writings. And then we have Harriet Beecher Stowe, who you might know as the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. This book truly showcased the horrors of slavery. Then we have Sojourner Truth, who was an outspoken advocate for many reform movements and was also the first black woman to win a court case against a white man. After that, we have the Grimke sisters, and they were the first nationally known white American female advocates for the abolition of slavery as well as equal women's rights. And we have Harriet Tubman, who was a courageous abolitionist who freed hundreds of slaves through the Underground Railroad. Finally, we have William Lloyd Garrison, who was an American journalistic crusader who published an abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, and he helped lead the successful abolitionist campaign against slavery in the United States. Next up, with the temperance movement. This is a movement during the early 19th and 20th century that tried to limit or outlaw the consumption and production of alcoholic beverages in the United States. Some important reformers to note are Lyman Beecher. He co-founded the American Temperance Society and wrote popular sermons on temperance, which were printed and distributed throughout the U.S. Then we have Mary Hunt. She became the single most powerful woman in the U.S. in terms of promoting temperance and prohibition. And we finally have Annie Wittenmeyer, who was an influential organizer in the temperance movement. After that, we have the women's rights movement. This is a movement based on feminist activity and thought that occurred during the 19th and early 20th century. It focused on legal issues and primarily on securing women's right to vote. First, we have to talk about an event that was extremely key in the women's rights movement. We have the Seneca Falls Convention. This was the first women's rights convention in the United States. It was held in July 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. The meeting launched a women's suffrage movement, which more than 7 decades later ensured women's right to vote. The Declaration of Sentiments was established in this convention. This declaration asserted the equality of all men and women, and it argued that women are oppressed by the government and the patriarchal society of which they are a part of. And we have some key important reformers. We have Susan B. Anthony, who was a pioneer crusader for women's suffrage in the United States. She was president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, and she helped pave the way for the 19th Amendment. And finally, we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was the main force behind the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention and was the primary author of its Declaration of Sentiments. Next up, we have prison/asylum reform. This is a movement that took place in the mid-18th century that was aimed at improving conditions for the mentally ill/prisoners in an attempt for a more effective and humane penal system. And we have one important reformer to note, who was Dorothy Dix. She was the main figure of this movement, and through her lobbying of state legislature and Congress, she helped create the first generation of American mental asylums. Finally, we have the education reform movement. This is a movement in the mid-18th century that aimed at providing more children with education, as the leaders of this movement believed education would help these children escape poverty and become good citizens. We have one important reformer to note, who was Horace Mann. He was basically the champion of this movement, and when he was elected into the Massachusetts Board of Education, Mann spearheaded the Common School movement and ensured that every child could receive a basic education